Allow me to tell you a story. The story is called The Wanderings of Arasmon. This is designed to open up your heart and to make you feel something. So if you're not in a good space or you do not have the privacy for this, I do not recommend you listen to this video now. Switch this off and wait until you are in the correct mood and the correct state to hear a heart-opening story. So here we go. Here's what I have for you. The Wanderings of Arasmon. Long ago, there lived a wandering musician and his wife, whose names were Arasmon and Chrysia. Arasmon played upon a lute, to which Chrysia sung, and their music was so beautiful that people followed them in crowds, and gave them as much money as they wanted. When Arasmon played, all who heard him were silent from wonder and admiration. But when Chrysia sung, they could not refrain from weeping, for her voice was more beautiful than anything they had ever heard before. Both were young and lovely, and were as happy as the day was long, for they had loved each other dearly, and liked wandering about, seeing new countries and people, making sweet music. They went to all sorts of places, sometimes to big cities, sometimes to little villages, sometimes to lonely cottages by the seashore, and sometimes they strolled along the green lakes and fields, singing and playing so exquisitely that the very birds flew down from the trees to listen to them. One day they crossed a dark line of hills and came out on a wild moorland country where they had never been before. On the side of the hill they saw a little village, and at once turned towards it, but as they drew near, Chrysia said, "What gloomy place is this? See how dark and miserable it looks." "Let us try to cheer it with some music," said Arasmon, and began to play upon his lute while Chrysia sung. One by one the villagers came out of their cottages and gathered around them to listen. But Chrysia thought that she had never before seen such forlorn-looking people. They were thin and bent. Their faces were pale and haggard. Also their clothes looked old and threadbare, and in some places were worn into holes. But they crowded around Arasmon and Chrysia and begged them to go on playing and singing. As they listened, the women shed tears and the men hid their faces and were silent. When they stopped, the people began to feel in their pockets as if to find some coins, but Arasmon cried, "Nay, good friends, keep your money for yourselves. You have not much of it to judge by your looks, but let us stay with you for tonight and give us food and lodging, and we shall think ourselves well paid, and will play and sing to you as much as you like. Stay with us as long as you can. Stay with us always," begged the people, and each one entreated to be allowed to receive the strangers and give them the best they had. So Arasmon and Chrysia played and sung to them till they were tired. And at last, when the heavy rain began to fall, They turned towards the village, but as they passed through its narrow streets, they thought the place itself looked even sadder than its inmates. The houses were ill-built and seemed to be almost tumbling down. The streets were uneven and badly kept. In the gardens they saw no flowers, but dank, dark weeds. They went into a cottage which the people pointed out to them, and Arasmon lay down by the fire, calling to Chrysia to rest also, as they had walked far and she must be weary. He soon fell asleep, but Chrysia sat at the door watching the dark clouds as they drifted over darker houses. Outside the cottage hung a blackbird in a cage, with drooping wings and scanty plumage. It was the only animal they had yet seen in the village, for of cats or dogs or singing birds there seemed to be none. When she saw it, Chrysia turned to the woman of the house, who stood beside her, and said, "Why don't you let it go? It would be so much happier flying about in the sunshine." "The sun never shines here," said the woman sadly. "It could not pierce through the dark clouds which hang over the village. Besides, we do not think of happiness. It is as much as we can do to live." "But tell me," said Chrysia, "what is it that makes you so sad, and your village such a dreary place? I have been to many towns in my life, but to none which looked like this." "Don't you know," said the woman, "that this place is spellbound?" "Spellbound?" cried Chrysia. "What do you mean?" The woman turned and pointed towards the moor. "Over yonder," she said, "dwells a terrible old wizard, by whom we are bewitched, and he has a number of little dark elves, who are his servants. And these are they who make our village what you see it. You don't know how sad it is to live here. The elves steal our eggs and milk and poultry, so that there is never enough for us to eat, and we are half starved. They put down our houses and undo our work as fast as we do it. They steal our corn, and when it is standing in sheaves, so that we find nothing but empty husks." And as she ceased speaking, the woman sighed heavily. "But if we do all of this harm," said Chrysia, "why do not some of you go to the moor and drive them away?" "It's part of the spell," said the woman, "that we can neither hear nor see them. I have heard my grandfather say that in the old time this place was no different to others, but one day this terrible old magician came and offered the villagers a great deal of money if they would let him dwell upon the moor, for before that it was covered with golden gorse and heather. And the country folk held their merry-makings there, and they were tempted with gold and sold it. And from that day the elves have tormented us. And as we cannot see them, we cannot get rid of them, but must just bear them as we may." "That is a sad way to speak," said Chrysia. "Can you not find out what the spell really is and break it?" "It is a song," said the woman, "and every night they sing it afresh. It is said that if anyone could go to the moor between midnight and dawn, We could hear them singing it and then sing it through the tune just as they do themselves. The charm would be broken and we should be free. But it must be someone who has never taken their money. So we cannot do it, for we can neither see nor hear them. But I have not taken their money, said Chrysia, and there is no tune that I cannot sing when I have heard it once. So I will go to the moor for you and break the spell. Nay, do not do such a thing, cried the woman, for the elves are most spiteful, and you don't know what harm they might do to you even if you set us free. Chrysia said no more, but all the evening she thought of what the woman had told her, and still looking out into the dismal street. When she went to bed she did not sleep, but lay till the clock struck 1. Then she rose softly and, wrapping herself in a cloak, opened the door and stepped out into the rain. As she passed, she looked up and saw the black bird crouching in the bottom of its cage. She opened the cage door to let it fly, but still it did not want to move. So she lifted it out in her hand. "Poor bird," she said gently. "I wish I could give this village its liberty, as easily as I can give yours." And carrying it with her, she walked on towards the moor. It was a large waste of land and looked as though it had been burnt, for the ground was charred and black, and there was no grass or green plant growing on it, but there were some blackened stumps of trees, and to these Chrysia went and hid herself one to wait and see what would come. She watched for a long time without seeing anyone, but at last there rose from the ground, not far from her, a lurid gleam, which spread and spread until it became a large circle of light, in the midst of which she saw small dark figures moving like ugly little men. The light was now so bright that she could distinguish each one quite plainly. Never before had she seen anything so ugly, for their faces were twisted and looked cruel and wicked. They joined hands and, forming a ring, danced slowly around, and as they did so, the ground opened, and there rose up in their center a tiny village exactly like the spellbound village, only that the houses were but a few inches high. Round the elves danced, and then they began to sing. Chrysia listened eagerly to their singing, and no sooner had they done than she opened her lips and sung the same tune through from beginning to end, just as she heard it. Her voice rang out loud and clear, and the sound the little village crumbled and fell away as though it had been made of dust. The elves stood silent for a moment, and then with a wild cry they all rushed towards Chrysia, and at their head she saw about 3 times the size of the others, who appeared to be their chief. "Come quickly, let us punish the woman who has dared to thwart us," he cried. "What shall we change her to?" "A frog to croak on the ground," one cried. "No." "An owl to hoot in the night," cried another. "Oh, for pity's sake," implored Chrysia, "don't change me to one of those loathsome creatures, so that if Arasmon finds me, he will spurn me." "Hear her," cried the chief, and let her have her will. Let her change her to no bird nor beast, but to a bright golden harp, and thus shall she remain, until upon her string someone shall play our tune, which she has dared to sing. Agreed, cried the others, and they all began to dance around Chrysia and to sing as they had sung around the village. She shrieked and tried to run, but they stopped her on every side. She cried, Arasmon, Arasmon! But no one came. And when the elf song was done and they disappeared, all that was left was a little golden harp hanging upon the boughs of the tree, and only the blackbird who had sat above knew what had become of poor Chrysia. When morning dawned and the villagers awoke, all felt that some great change had taken place. The heavy cloud which hung above the village had cleared away. The sun shone brightly and the sky was blue. Streams which had been dry for years were running clear and fresh, and the people all felt strong and able to work again. The trees were beginning to bud, and in their branches sang birds whose voices had not been heard there for so many a long year. The villagers looked from one to other and said, Surely the spell is broken. Surely the elves must have fled. And they wept for joy. Arasmon awoke with the first beam of the sun, and finding Chrysia was not there, he rose and went to seek her in the village, calling, Chrysia, Chrysia, the sun is up and we must journey on our way. But no Chrysia answered, so he walked down all the streets calling, Chrysia, come Chrysia, but no Chrysia came. Then he said, She has gone into the fields to look for wild flowers and will soon be back. So he waited for her patiently, but the sun rose high, the villagers went to their work, and she did not return. At this Arasmon was frightened and asked everyone if they had met her, if they had seen her, but each one shook their head and said, No, I haven't heard anything of her. Then he called some of the men together and told them that his wife had wandered away. And he feared lest she might lose herself and go still further. He asked them to help him to look for her. So some went one way and some another to search, and Arasmon himself walked for miles, the whole country round, calling, Chrysia, Chrysia, but no answer came. The sun was beginning to set and twilight to cover the land, when Arasmon came onto the moor where Chrysia had met her fate. That too was changed. Flowers and grass were already beginning to grow there, and the children of the village, who till now had never dared to venture near it, were playing about it. Arasmon could hear their voices as he came near. There was a tree which Chrysia had leaned, and on which now hung the golden harp. In the branches above sat the blackbird, singing, and Arasmon stopped and listened to its song and thought he had never heard a bird sing so sweetly before. for it sang the magic song by which Chrysia had broken the elf spell, the first tune it had heard since regaining its liberty. "Dear Blackbird," said Arasmon, looking up to it, "I wish your singing could tell me where to find my wife, Chrysia." And as he looked up, he saw a golden harp hanging upon the branches, and he took it down and ran his fingers over the strings. Never before did harp give forth such music. It was like a woman's voice, and was most beautiful, but so sad, that when Arasmon heard it, he felt inclined to cry. It seemed to be calling for help, but he could not understand what it had said, though each time he touched the strings it cried, "Arasmon, Arasmon, I am here. It is I, Chrysia." But though Arasmon listened and wondered at its tones, yet he did not know what it said. He examined it carefully. It was a beautiful little harp, made of pure gold, and the top was a pair of golden hands and arms clasped together. "I will keep it," said Arasmon, "for I never yet heard a harp with such tone. And when Chrysia comes, she shall sing to it." But Chrysia was nowhere to be found, and at last the villagers declared she must be lost, or herself have gone away on purpose, and that it was vain to seek her further. At this Arasmon was angry, and saying that he would seek Chrysia as long as he had life, he left the village to wander over the whole world till he should find her. He went on foot, and took with him the golden harp. He walked for many, many miles, far away from the village and the moor, and when he came to any farmhouses or met any country people on the road, he began to play. And everyone thronged around him and stared in breathless surprise at his beautiful music. When he had done, he would ask them, "Have you seen my wife Chrysia? She is dressed in white and gold, and sings more sweetly than any of the birds in heaven." But all shook their heads and said no, she had not been here. And whenever he came to a strange village where he had not been before, he called, "Chrysia, Chrysia, are you here?" But no Chrysia answered. Only the harp in his hands cried whenever he touched its strings, "It is I, Arasmon, it is I, Chrysia." But though he thought its notes like Chrysia's voice, he never understood them. He wandered for days and months and years, through countries and villages which he had never known before. When night came and he found himself in fields alone, he would lie down upon his cloak and sleep with his head resting upon the harp. And if by chance one of the golden threads was touched, it would cry, "Arasmon, awake, I am here." Then he would dream that Chrysia was calling him, and would wake up and start to look for her, thinking she must be close at hand. One day towards night, when he had walked far and was very tired, he came to a little village on a lonely rocky coast by the sea, and he found that a thick mist had come up and hung over the village, so that he could barely see the path before him as he walked. But he found his way towards the beach, and there stood a number of fisherwomen looking and trying to find through the mist towards the sea and speaking anxiously. "What is wrong, and for whom are you watching, good folk?" he asked them. "We are watching for our husband," answered one. They went out in their boats, fishing in the early morning when it was quite light, and then arose this dreadful fog. "They should have come back long ago, but we fear lest they may lose their way in the darkness and strike on a rock and be drowned." "I too have lost my wife, Chrysia," cried Arasmon. "Has she passed by here? She had long golden hair, and her gown was white and gold. She sung with a voice like an angel." The women all said, "No, we have not seen her, but still." They strained their eyes towards the sea, and Arasmon also began to watch for the return of the boats. They waited and waited, but they did not come, and every moment the darkness grew thicker and thicker, so that the women could not see each other's faces, though they stood quite near together. They waited and waited, but they did not come, and every moment the darkness grew thicker and thicker, so that the women could not see each other's faces, though they stood quite near together. When Arasmon took his harp and began to play, and its music floated over the water for miles through the darkness, but the women were weeping so for their husbands that they did not hear it. "It's useless to watch," said one. "They cannot steer their boats in such a darkness. We shall never see them again." "I will wait all night till morning," said another, "and all day, next day, and next night, till I see some sign of the boats and know if they are living or dead." But as she stopped speaking, there rose a cry of, "Here they are!" And 2 or 3 fishing boats were pushed onto the sand close by where they stood, and the women threw their arms around their husbands' necks, and all shouted for joy. The fishermen asked who it was who had played the harp, for, they said, "It was that which saved us. We were far from land, and it was so dark that we could not tell whether to go left or to right, and had no sign to guide us ashore, when of a sudden we heard the most beautiful music, and we followed the sound and came in quite safely. 'Twas this good harper who played while we watched," said the women, and one and all turned to Arasmon, and told him with tears of their gratitude, and asked him what they could do for him, or what they could give him in token of their thankfulness. But Arasmon shook his head and said, "You can do nothing for me, unless you can tell me where to seek my wife Chrysia. It is to find her I am wandering." And when the women shook their heads and said again they knew nothing of her, the harp strings, as he touched them, cried again, "Arasmon, Arasmon, listen to me. It is I, Chrysia." But again, no one understood, and although they all pitied him, no one could help him. Next morning, when the mist had cleared away, and the sun was shining, a little ship set sail for foreign lands, and Arasmon begged the captain to take him in that he might seek Chrysia still further. They sailed and sailed till at last they came to the country for which they were bound, but they found the whole land in confusion, and war and fighting everywhere, and all the people were leaving their homes and hiding themselves in towns, for fear of a terrible enemy who was invading them. But no one hurt Arasmon as he wandered on with his harp in his hand, only no one would stop to answer him when he asked if Chrysia had been there, for everyone was too frightened and hurried to heed him. At last he came to the chief city where the king dwelt, and here he found all the men building walls and fortresses and preparing to defend, but all the soldiers were gloomy and low-spirited. "It is impossible for us to conquer," they said, "for there are 3 of them to every one of us, and they will take our city and make our king prisoner." That night, as the watchmen looked over the walls, they saw in the distance an immense army marching towards them, and their swords and helmets glittered in the moonlight. Then they gave the signal, and the captains gathered together their men to prepare for fighting. But so sure they were of being beaten that it was with difficulty their officers could bring them to the walls. "It would be better," said the soldiers, "to lay down our arms at once and let the enemy enter, for then we should not lose our lives as well as our city and our wealth." Then Arasmon heard this. He sat up upon the walls of the town and began to play upon his harp, and this time its music was so loud and so clear that it could be heard far and wide, and its sound so exultant and joyous that when the soldiers heard it they raised their heads and their fears vanished, and they started forward shouting and calling as they would conquer or be killed. Then the enemy attacked their city, but the soldiers within met them with so much force that they were driven back and had to fly, and the victorious army followed them and drove them quite out of their country. And Arasmon went with them, playing on his harp to cheer them as he went. When they knew the victory was theirs, all the captains wondered what had caused their sudden success. And one of the lieutenants said, "It was that strange harper who went with us, playing on his harp. When our men heard it, they became as brave as lions." So the captains sent for Arasmon, but when he came, they were astonished to see how worn and thin he looked, and could scarcely believe it was he who had made such wonderful music, for his face had grown thin and pale, and there were grey locks in his hair. They asked him what he would like to have, saying they would give him whatever he chose for the great service he had done them. Arasmon only shook his head and said, There is nothing I want that you can give me. I am seeking the whole world round to find my wife, Chrysia. It is many, many years since I lost her. We two were as happy as birds on a bough. We wandered the world, singing and playing in the sunshine, but now she is gone and I care for nothing else. And the captains looked pityingly at him for all thought him mad, and could not understand what the harp said when he played on it again, and it cried, "Listen, Arasmon, I too am here, I, Chrysia." So Arasmon left that city and started again, and wandered for days and months and years. He came by many strange places, and met with many strange people, but he found no trace of Chrysia, and each day he looked older and sadder and thinner. At length he came to a country where the king loved nothing on earth so much as music. So fond of it was he that he had musicians and singers by the score, always living in his palace, and there was no way of pleasing him so well as by sending a new musician or singer. So when Arasmon came into the country, and the people heard how marvellously he played, they said at once, "Let us take him to the king. The poor man is mad. Hear how he goes on asking for his wife, but mad or not, his playing will delight the king. Let us take him at once to the palace." So, though Arasmon would have resisted them, they dragged him away to the court and sent a messenger to the king to say they had found a poor, mad, wandering harper who played music of which the like they had never seen before. The king and queen and all the court sat feasting when the messenger came in, saying that the people were bringing a new harper to play before his majesty. "A new harper! That is good hearing. Let him be brought here to play to us at once." So Arasmon was led into the hall and up to the golden thrones on which sat the king and queen. A wonderful hall it was, made of gold and silver and crystal and ivory, and the courtiers dressed in blue and green and gold and diamonds were a sight to see. Behind the throne were 12 young maidens dressed in pure white, who sung most sweetly, and behind them were the musicians who accompanied them on every kind of instrument. Arasmon had never in his life seen such a splendid sight. "Come here," cried the king to him, "let us hear you play." The singers ceased singing, and the musicians smiled scornfully, for they could not believe Arasmon's music could equal theirs, for he looked to be in most sorry plight. He had walked far, and the dust of the roads was on him. His clothes were worn threadbare, and stained and soiled, while his face was so thin and anxious and sad that it was pitiful to see. But the harp of pure shining gold was undulled and untarnished. He began to play, and then all smiles ceased, and the women began to weep, and the men sat and stared at him in astonishment. When he had done, the king started up, and throwing his arms about his neck, cried, "Stay with me. You shall be my chief musician. Never before have I heard playing like yours, and whatever you want I will give you." But when he heard this, Arasmon knelt on one knee and said, My gracious lord, I cannot stay. I have lost my wife, Chrysia. I must search all over the world till I find her. How beautiful she was and how sweetly she sung. Her singing was far sweeter than even the music of my harp. Indeed, cried the king. Then I too would fain hear her, but stay with me and I will send messengers all over the world to seek her far and near, and they will find her much sooner than you. So Arasmon stayed at the court, but he said that if Chrysia did not come soon, he must go farther and seek her himself. The king gave orders that he should be clad in the costliest clothes and have all he could want given to him. And after this he would hear no music but Arasmon's playing, so all the other musicians were jealous and wished he had never come to the palace. But the strangest thing was that no one but Arasmon could play upon his golden harp. All the king's harpers tried, and the king himself tried also, but when they touched the strings there came from a strange melancholy wailing, and no one but Arasmon could bring out its beautiful tones. But the courtiers and musicians grew more and more angry with Arasmon, till at last they hated him so bitterly and only wanted to do him some harm, for they said, "Who is he, that our king should love and honor him before us? After all, it is not his playing which is so beautiful. It is chiefly the harp on which he plays, and if that were taken away from him, he would be no better than the rest of us." And then they began to consult together as to how they should steal his harp. One hot summer evening, Arasmon went into the palace gardens and sat down to rest beneath a large beech tree. When a little way off, he saw two courtiers talking together and heard that they spoke of him, though they did not see him or know that he was there. "The poor man is mad," said one. "Of that there is little doubt, but mad or not, as long as he plays on his harp, the king will not listen to anybody else." "The only way is to take the harp from him," said the other. "But it is hard to know how to get it away, for he will never let it out of his hands." "We must take it from him when he is sleeping," said the first. "Certainly," said the other. And then Arasmon heard them settle how and when they would go to his room at night to steal his harp. He sat still till they were gone, and then he rose and, grasping the harp tenderly, turned from the palace and walked away through the garden gates. "I have lost Chrysia," he said, "and now they would take from me even my harp, the only thing I have to love in all this world. But I will go away, far off, where they will never find me." And when he was out of sight, he ran with all his might and never rested till he was far away on a lonely hill with no one to see him. The stars were beginning to shine, though it was not yet dark. Arasmon sat on a throne and looked at the country far and near. He could hear the sheep bells tinkling around him, and far, far off in the distance he could hear the city and palace he had left. Then he began to play on his harp, and he played the sheep, and as he played the sheep stopped browsing and drew near to him to listen. The stars grew brighter and the evening darker, and he saw a woman carrying a child coming up the hill. She looked pale and tired, but her face was very happy as she sat down not far from Arasmon and listened to his playing, while she looked eagerly across the hill as if she watched for someone who was coming. Presently she turned and said, "How beautifully you play. I've never heard music like it before. What makes you look so sad? Are you unhappy?" "Yes," said Arasmon, "I am very miserable. I lost my wife Chrysia many years ago, and now I don't know where she can be." "It is a year since I have seen my husband," said the woman. "He went to the war a year ago, but there is a peace and he is coming back, and tonight he will come over this hill. It is just here we parted, and now I am come to meet him." "How happy you must be," said Arasmon. "I shall never see Chrysia again." And as he spoke he struck a chord on the harp, which cried, "Arasmon, my husband, why do you not know me? It is I, Chrysia." "Do not say that," continued the woman. "You will find her some day. Do not sit here. Was it here you parted from her?" Then Arasmon told her of how they had gone to a strange, desolate village and rested there for the night. And in the morning Chrysia was gone, and that he had wandered all over the world looking for her ever since. "I think you are foolish," said the woman. "Perhaps your wife has been waiting for you at that village all this time. I would go back to the place where I parted from her if I were you, and wait there till she returns. How could I meet my husband if I did not come to the spot where we were last together? We might both wander on forever and ever, and never find each other. And now see, here he is coming." And she gave a cry of joy and ran to meet a soldier who was walking up the hill. Arasmon watched them as they met and kissed, and saw the father lift his child in his arms. Then the three walked over the hill together, and when they were gone he sat down and wept bitterly. "What is it that she said?" "That I ought to go back to the spot where we parted. She will not be there, but I will go and die at the place where I last saw her." So again he grasped his harp and started. He travelled many days and weeks by land and by sea, till late one day he came in sight of the hill on which he stood near the little village. But at first he could not believe that he had come to the right place, so changed did all appear. He stopped and looked around him in astonishment. He stood in a shady lane. The arching trees met over his head, full of spring flowers, and either side of the hedge were fields full of young green corn. "Can this be the wretched bare road down which we walked together? I would indeed it were, and that she were with me now," he said. When he looked across to the village, the change seemed greater still. There were many more cottages, and they were trim and well kept. standing in neat gardens full of flowers. He heard the cheerful voices of the peasants and the laughter of the village children. The whole place seemed to be full of life and happiness. He stopped again upon the mound where he and Chrysia had first played and sung. "It is many, many a long year since I was here," he said. "Time has changed and all things strangely, but it would be hard to say which is the more altered, this village or I. For then it was sunk in poverty and wretchedness, and now it has gained happiness and wealth, and I who was so happy and glad, and now, broken down and worn, I have lost my only wealth, my wife, Chrysia. It was just here she stood and sung, and now I shall never hear her again, or hear her singing." There came past him a young girl driving some cows, and she turned and spoke to her. "Tell me, I beg," he said, "is not your village much changed of late years? I was here long ago, but I cannot think it is the same place, for this is bright and flourishing a town as I have ever seen, and I remember it only as a dreary tumble-down village where the grass never grew." "Oh," said the girl, "then you were here in our bad time. But we do not like to speak of that for fear our troubles should return. Folks say we were spellbound. 'Tis so long ago that I can scarcely remember it, for I was quite a little child then. But a wandering musician and his wife set us free. At least everything began to mend after they came. And now we think they must have been angels from heaven, for next day they went, and we have never seen them since." "It was I, my wife, and Chrysia," cried Arasmon. "Have you seen her? Has she been here? I have sought all over the world ever since, but I cannot find her, and now I fear lest she be dead." The girl stared at him in surprise. "You poor old man, of what are you talking? You must surely be mad to say such things. These musicians were the most beautiful people upon the earth, and they were young and dressed in shining white gold, and you were old and grey and haggard, and surely you were very ill too, for you seem to be so weak that you can scarcely walk. Come home with me, and I will give you food and rest till you are better." Arasmon shook his head. "I am seeking Chrysia," he said, "and I will rest no more till I have found her." And the girl, seeing that he was determined, left him alone and went on her way, driving her cows before her. When he had gone, Arasmon sat by the wayside and wept as though his heart would break. "It is too true," he said. "I am so old and worn that when I find her, she will not know me." And again fell a-weeping. His hand struck the harp strings, and they cried. "I have watched you through all these years, my Arasmon. Take comfort, I am very near." And his tears ceased, and he was soothed by the voice of the harp, though he knew not why. Then he rose. "I will go to the moor," he said, "and look for the tree on which I found my harp, and that will be my last resting place. For surely my strength will carry me no farther." So he tottered slowly on, calling as he went in a weak voice, "Chrysia, my Chrysia, are you here? I have sought you over the world since you left me, and now that I am old and like to die. I am come to seek you where we parted. Then he came upon the moor. He wandered again, at the change of all the country round. He thought of the charred, blackened waste on which he had stood before, and now he looked with amazement at the golden gorse, the purple heather, so thick that he could scarcely pick his way amongst it. "It is a beautiful place now," he said, "but I liked it better years ago, deserted and desolate though it was, for my Chrysia was here." There were so many trees upon the common that he could not tell which was the one on which his harp had hung, but unable to go any farther, he staggered and sunk down beneath a large oak tree, in whose branches a blackbird was singing most sweetly. The sun was setting just as of yore when he had found his harp, and most of the birds' songs were over, but this one bird still sung sweet and clear, and Arasmon, tired and weak though he was, raised his head and listened. "I never heard a bird sing like that," he said. "What is the tune it sings? I will play it on my harp before I die." And with what strength remained to him, he reached forth his trembling hand, and grasping his harp, struck upon it the notes of the bird's song. Then he fell back exhausted, and his eyes closed. At once the harp slid from his hand, and Chrysia stood beside him. Chrysia, dressed of, as old in shining white and gold, with bright hair and eyes. "Arasmon!" she cried. "See, it is I, Chrysia!" But Arasmon did not move. Then she raised her voice and sung more sweetly than the bird overhead, and Arasmon opened his eyes and looked at her. "Chrysia! I have found my wife Chrysia!" And he laid his head on her bosom and died. And when Chrysia saw Arasmon, her heart broke, and she lay beside him and died without a word. In the morning, when some of the villagers crossed the common, they saw Arasmon and Chrysia lying beneath the oak tree in each other's arms. And drew near them, thinking they were asleep. But when they saw their faces, they knew they were dead. Then an old man stooped and looked at Chrysia and said, "Surely it is the woman who came to us and sang long ago, when we were in our troubles, and though he is sadly changed and worn, it is like her husband who played for her singing." Then came the girl who had driven the cows, and told them how he had met Arasmon, and all he had said to her. He searched everywhere for her, for his wife, and he said, I am glad he has found her. Where could she be? Would that we had known it was he," they all said. "How we would have greeted him! But see, he looks quite content, as if he wished nothing more, since he has found his wife Chrysia."